All right. Welcome to another episode of City of Seattle Budget School right here on Converge Media. And as usual, I'm joined by Kevin Schofield of sccinsight.com. How are you?
I'm doing great, Omari. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's good. It turns out people really like budget school. They like learning
I don't
about,
know. I don't know why, but hey, that's great.
sometimes, it comes to programming, we throw some things against the wall. Sometimes they stick like this, sometimes they don't. But I really feel that people like learning one, and especially learning what's going on with this money, and especially learning who's doing what with the money down in City Hall.
And that we're going to talk all about that today. Today we're all about where's the money going out the door, how the city is spending it.
Right. And so I said the last episode we talked about revenue and where all the money's coming in from. And today we're talking about expenses, expenses, expenses. Uh, Speaking of that, Kevin, let's start it off here. How much does the city spend every year?
Yeah, well, the budget for 2021, this year's budget, is $6.6 billion. 1.6 billion of that is unrestricted general, what they call general fund dollars, and 5 billion is restricted use, meaning the city can only spend it for specific purposes. And the money is spread across 42 different top-level departments in the city government.
$6 billion. 6 billion across 42 departments. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yep.
How does that break down?
Yeah, so it's not spread evenly. If you just look at this pie chart here that we're going to put up here, you can see that there's a huge difference in the size of different sizes the departments get. So there are two. Actually, can we go back to the slide before that? That pie chart right there. You can see there's two really huge departments. There are 10 very, very big ones, and there's 30 pretty small ones. So now let's go ahead and break that out. The two huge departments are the two utilities that the city owns. Seattle City Light, the electric power company, and Seattle Public Utility is the garbage, water, and sewer company. Public Utilities is going to spend about $1.4 billion on operations and capital expenses this year. And City Light's going to spend just a little less at $1.36 billion. Together, those two are over 40% of the city's entire budgeted expenses. And they're really run as separate businesses. So City Hall has some control over how they spend that money to run the business and deliver the services, but it mostly can't take any of that money out to go pay for other things. The only way it can do that is through utility taxes. And as we talked about in the last episode, they do actually get a fair amount of money out of these businesses with that, right? But they can't just say, oh, we're going to spend less on operations and spend more on this, streets or things like that, right? They don't. So for the purposes of the whole rest of the conversation we're going to have today, let's set those two aside and focus on the other 3.9 billion of expenses in the city budget. So there are 10 city departments with annual budgets that are greater than $100 million. SDOT is the biggest of those at about 637 million. And a little more than half, 55-60% of that is capital expenses, meaning they're paying for buildings, maintaining existing buildings, and replacing buildings. The city's transportation infrastructure is about $28 billion worth of stuff, and normally the going sort of figure for these things is that a city should be spending about somewhere between 1 and 2% of the value of those assets on annual maintenance of that. So the fact that they're spending about $365 million on managing those $28 billion of infrastructure is about right. So if we go down this list of these other big departments, Finance General isn't so much a department as it's sort of like a big bank account for the city. And it's where the city council will park money that they're setting aside, like the participatory budgeting and equitable communities initiative money. That's about $60 million right there. While they were early this year trying to figure out, okay, what exactly are we going to do with that? We don't want to release it yet until we see an actual plan. They park it in Finance General, right? And it's also where they put money for emergency reserves. So they budgeted this year because they spent down the city's emergency reserves during COVID last year. They've got 72 million in Finance General this year to start replenishing those reserves. SPD, the police department, is about $363 million this year. Now that's a reduction of about 12% from last year. But most of that reduction was because the mayor and the city council moved a bunch of civilian functions out of the department, like the 911 call center. And
So,
also because of the high
can
attrition.
I jump
Yeah.
in right there then? And so that decrease that we see
Yeah.
in the Seattle Police Department budget, when someone sees that, that isn't like directly on, you know, you hear about defund, like this is
Right.
defunding of the Seattle Police Department by that amount. That decrease, a big part of what we see is that there's been a reduction in the services performed by SPDs that are now in another department.
That's a part of it. Another part is the attrition that they had this year. But you know, one of the things when you look at SPD's budget and really go deep into it, and we'll probably do that in the coming weeks once we see what the mayor is proposing for SPD in 2022, you see that, you know, while it's easy looking and go, wow, it's a really bloated budget. It's enormous. It was like, you know, over $400 million last year. It's almost all personnel expenses, right? So if you want to, I mean, you could certainly make an argument that it's bloated, right? And if you do make that argument, if you want to cut it, really the only thing you can do that will make a big difference is either cut the number of officers or cut their pay, right? That's the only way you're going to get that big number down. That, you know, they don't spend a lot on equipment. They don't spend a lot on facilities. It's almost all personnel expenses. So finance administrative services, another department in this list of sort of top 10, it's kind of like the department that does everything else. It's a thing that sort of keeps the trains running and you know, keeps city government kind of running all the stuff that is like low profile. So they hire all the janitorial services for all the city buildings, right? They run a central purchasing office. They manage the city's fleet of vehicles. All that stuff is in there. They also have $23 million in there just to pay the annual debt service on all the city's bonds, right? So finance administrative services is where all that other, you think of it as the department of all the other stuff. That's where that all is. The human resources number looks huge, at about 325 million. That's because there's $275 million in there to pay for healthcare expenses and health insurance for all the 11,000 city employees. So they spend more than $250 million a year on healthcare for city employees. A lot of money.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Human Services Department is just about over $300 million this year. And that is going to be really interesting to watch next year, because going into next year is when this new King County Regional Homeless Authority is supposed to be taking over most of the homeless response for the city. So instead of staffing up and running a whole department to do homeless response themselves, the city is going to be writing a big check every year to the Regional Homeless Authority. And we're going to see what that ends up looking like and how much the mayor and the city council care about kind of the details, how much they're going to try to micromanage exactly how that big check gets spent, right? IT department's a central IT shop for most of the city departments, and that ends up getting billed back. Department of Education Early Learning is where the Seattle preschool program is, which is where most of their budget goes.
Right. And also, I don't know if it plays into a cost for them, but that early learning program, just because we talk about it a lot here, that's also where Seattle Promise is at.
That's where Seattle Promise is at.
And that's where high school students, high school seniors, and any graduates from Seattle Public Schools get 2 years free school there at any of the Seattle colleges.
Great, awesome, incredibly effective program. So together, those 10, that's $3.27 billion. That's setting aside the utilities, that's 84% of the city's expenses, right? So, and that's just 10 of the 40 departments there. So now there's 15 more departments with budgets between $10 million and $100 million. The libraries, they get about $87 million, and that's probably going to be going up more going in next year now that they're reopening all the branches, right? And you can see that there are 2 pension funds in here for police and firefighters. Those are actually old legacy programs. They're old style pension programs for firefighters and officers that were hired prior to 1977, most of which are retired, but they're still collecting benefits. So those are still in there, and those will kind of go away over the years. Legislative department, that's the city council, city clerk, and the city auditor. Community safety and communication center is a new department. That's where the 911 call center moved out of SBT into to run the civilian run department. And that's also going to be interesting watching going to next year, because that's where the city council wants to move other civilian public safety functions.
So it said in there $17 million. Is that enough money?
Well, right now it's just SPD's 911 call center.
Okay.
And it's not actually including the fire department's 911 call center. That's still separate. When they looked at, hey, should we move the parking enforcement officers over to this department? End up, they decided to move it into SDOT instead.
And is this just salaries for this
There's a
communication, or is it also they have their own facilities?
They've got their own facilities, a little bit of equipment there, a little bit of software to help manage, the protocol of how they talk to people over 911 calls and how they dispatch things, but mostly it's personnel expenses.
Mm-hmm.
So these 15 departments are $540 million, and that's 14%. So between the top 10 and these 15, we've accounted for 98% of the city spends, and we still got 15 departments to go here, right? So here's the last 15, and all these have budgets under $10 million. Collectively, that's about $66 million. And just to put that in perspective, you put those 15 departments together, and you're still spending less on that than you are on the libraries. Those 15 together, less than the library's budget, right? So it's less than 2% of all the spend, right? Employee retirement system department is in there. It's kind of a little deceptive when you think about it, because it doesn't look like very much money. That's a group of people that it's almost all salaries. It's a group of people that are managing the $3 billion investment portfolio. That's the retirement system for investment fund for the city. And it's also the set of people who manage actually paying out benefits, right? You also see the Community Police Commission and the Office of Inspector General in this list. But you probably notice you don't see OPA, the Office of Police Accountability. And that's just this weird, important nuance. OPA budget is inside of SPD's budget. Now, you could step back and go, whoa, OPA works SPD? They don't. They don't. The director of OPA actually is appointed independently by the mayor and the city council, and doesn't report to the chief of police or anybody in SPD. But what they did here is they put the budget in that list, and they organizationally put them in SPD, because that solves a whole bunch of problems to give OPA access to all of SPD's records. Because administratively, they're inside the department, they can get at everything. It looks a little weird from the outside, but there is an actual method to their madness.
It sounds a little weird from the outside as well. I mean, this, of course, isn't the OPA police school today, but looks a little weird from the outside.
It looks a little weird, but that's what's going on with it. They did it to make sure that OPA had access to all of SPD's records without any weird legal agreements or union agreements or anything. They're administratively part of SPD, and so they're on the inside, and they get access to everything.
Right. I'll just say this, I'll let you move on, that we also make the laws that we're governed by. We also approve contracts that guide these. And so if we've made some weird arrangement, then I'm sure that the city as well, if it wanted a different arrangement, could do so or bargain for that, or at least go for that.
Right. This is certainly something they could bargain in the SPA contract.
Right.
But there's also state laws and federal laws that are beyond the city government's control for some of that. Right?
Okay.
So it's pretty complicated. There's this huge range in different departments here, from the really big utilities down to very, very tiny little departments across these 42.
Right. And so now you spend a lot of time here going from big to small, and we see that the biggest, of course, the utilities, and thank goodness for the most part that money is hands off. But it makes up a big chunk there. We said $3.9 billion, right? Between those two there, and then you've broken them down into other categories, from biggest into the smallest. And I think it's good for people to see that some of the departments or places where the money goes that people have high expectations of, they don't really have a commensuratory budget to match the expectations of the public at times. Anyways, you've gone from big to small. Why?
Yeah, because if you want to have a large impact on the city budget, you have to focus on where the money is. Right? $10 million sounds like an enormous amount of money, but it's a rounding error in this budget, right? It's like 0.15% of the entire city budget is $10 million, right? And that's more than the entire budget for 15 different departments in the city. So if you got a great idea for a new program that's going to cost $10 million, like a new community-based public safety program, you either need to find $10 million of new revenues, or take $10 million away from something. And I can right off the top of my head tell you 15 places where you should not look for $10 million because that's more than their entire budget. If you've got big ideas, and we should have big ideas, right? We have to look at the big departments in order to find that stuff. Now, if you want to fund a small thing, like, $50K to make some improvements to your neighborhood park, or to, improve an unsafe street intersection, then you've got more choices about that, right? But the big point here is that the size of your ambitions makes a huge difference in where you spend your time looking for money.
Right. And so what else do people want to know, need to know as far as looking for money, how the money is spent?
Well, so people need to pay attention to what is often called the color of money, because not all money is the same. You can't necessarily do the same thing with every dollar in this budget. We talked at the beginning about how 1.6 billion is unrestricted, what they call general fund money, and 5 billion is restricted use, including virtually all the money in Seattle City Light and Seattle Public Utilities, because, as you mentioned before, they're run basically as separate businesses, and the city is required by law to keep that money inside the business and plug it back in. But let's go back and look at those top 10 departments again, and this time paying attention to whether their money is general fund or restricted, right? And you see, it's all over the map. SDOT, almost all restricted use funds, right? A lot of federal and state grants. Money comes in from the Move Seattle levy, which is restricted about what they can do with it. Real estate excise tax, all those things come with restrictions. So you just can't go raid SDOT's piggy bank to pay for parks, for example, right? Most of that money is specifically required to be spent on transportation, right? SPD is just the opposite. It's almost entirely general fund dollars. And that's good news for the folks who would like to redirect some of that to community-based public safety programs, right? They could do that. The money doesn't have strings attached that would prevent you from doing that. And the fire department is entirely funded with general fund dollars. So that's in a very similar vein. Though, there are less people saying, hey, we should redirect fire department money. Human resources, we talked about, is almost all healthcare spending. And that's restricted use because they're required under contract to provide for healthcare expenses, right? The IT department bills back its services, so its spending is restricted in the sense that because it's essentially contracting with departments, it has to spend the money doing what it contracted with them to do, right? And the Parks Department is split. There's money that comes in from things like the Metropolitan Parks District and other grant money, but there's also general fund. And the Department of Education Early Learning gets most of its money from the Families Education Preschool and Promise for both the Seattle Preschool Program and, as you mentioned earlier, the Seattle Promise College Fund.
Right. So how's the mayor and the city council, maybe even how is not the right word, but how does the mayor and the city council to decide, like when they're putting a budget together, how much to take from, a general fund or taking into consideration of restricted dollars or this color of money?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's some tricky stuff that goes into doing this. Generally, they spend restricted use funds first, so they can maintain the maximum amount of flexibility and save those general fund dollars that you can use, wherever they want at the end, right? And one of the tricky things that they'll do is that if they fund themselves with extra restricted use dollars, sometimes they'll swap it in to replace general fund dollars. So, like, particularly when they get new revenues and things. And we're going to see how this happens this year with the new payroll tax funds, where the city council's put some restrictions on how they can use it. A lot of it's supposed to go into housing. Now, so they've got this new restricted funds that they could put into housing. Are they just going to add it so there's more funds altogether in that pot? Or are they going to put that in there and then take out some of the general funds so they can spend it on something else, right? And they can be pretty sneaky about this. Sometimes, they can act and
I'm sorry, what did you say? They can be what?
Sneaky. They can be sneaky about
okay.
this. So if the taxpayers approve a new tax levy, sometimes they'll just swap it. But they'll still talk about, like, hey, we've got these new tax funds that we put into this, even though the whole dollar amount doesn't necessarily go up as much as you'd think, right? Now, sometimes some of the tax levies are written to prevent this. So, for example, the parks levy. The parks levy has a whole bunch of extra money to go into parks, but it's written in there that the city is required to spend a minimum dollar amount of general fund dollars on parks every year. and it can't go below that amount.
So it's not replacing the general,
Yeah,
like you're not swapping.
They can't swap it out, right? They have to always, in that way they made sure that the parks levy fund that went in was in addition to what was already being spent, and not one of these kind of sneaky replacements. So watch out for dollar swaps. And in the coming weeks, as we look at the mayor's budget and we look at what the city council does, we're almost definitely going to see some of those, and we'll call them out so you can see them. And maybe we'll think they're okay, and maybe we think they won't be okay, but we'll still definitely.
So I think we got to put in a budget school buzzer. So it's swap.
Yeah. So we got to watch out for some false promises there.
All right. So, man, Kevin, you covered a lot as far as the expense. 6.6. Who knew 6.6 billion could go so fast? Even in explaining it, you've done a very good job here in explaining it. Tell us what's up next episode.
Yeah. So our last episode, before the mayor's budget is released, we're going to talk about the ways that you can get involved in the budget process this year.
I think that's probably going to be one of our most important episodes, how you can get involved. All right. On behalf of my colleague here, the wordy and nerdy, Kevin Schofield, this has been Seattle Budget School. We'll catch you next episode.